Hello everybody, welcome to a short video about what everybody's talking about, which is AI. And in this video, we're going to ask the question, should you trust it? My name is Rich Hoyer. I'm co-founder and CEO of Finoptic. We're a boutique FinOps consulting firm. I have a bunch of experience managing cloud costs in the FinOps space. Started out at Cloudability years ago, and then started and ran the FinOps practices at Anika, which is an AWS Premier Partner, and SADA, which is a Google GCP partner, and starting to really go down the road of researching a lot more around AI in the context mainly of the work that we do, but this video is just completely broad for anybody using ChatGPT or Gemini or any of the commonly available sort of chatbots that are online. And as I'm learning more, I thought it'd be fun to really start examining this question about trust. So again, when we talk about AI, the context that most of us think of are things like chatbots that we have access to online, like ChatGPT, like Gemini. The technical term for this version of AI is a large language model. And it's key to spend just a few moments talking about what these are, because that will help you understand where there can be inaccuracies and where there can be things like bias, which are the topics we're going to talk about. So what are large language models? Essentially, the idea is you gather an enormous amount of computing power and you just make it read a bunch of stuff. It's called the corpus, but think of it as literally introducing all this computing power to the world's largest library and nearly, inconceivably large body of knowledge. And it doesn't memorize the actual knowledge that's in the library, but what it learns to do is recognize patterns of language found within that body of knowledge. And that's an important distinction because the model doesn't actually literally memorize every word of every book. Rather, it represents those sort of with numbers, and it learns how to take an input that it's given, and given all the patterns it observed in the past, in the corpus, what we can refer to as a library, it predicts, for example, what the answer to a question that you asked might be, or it predicts what you may be looking for if you ask it to complete some kind of task, like say something or draw something. So think of these as being models of patterns. And the reason that's important is the larger the amount of information that the model is trained on, the smarter, in air quotes, the model is, meaning the more accurate and relevant the responses that you get out of it are going to be. So in some of our testing here at Finoptic, we're playing around with smaller, earlier models, small enough that we could run them on our own machines as opposed to the gigantic ones that you have access to via something like ChatGPT or Gemini. And what we found was you get some sort of comically inaccurate answers, although it does, as we'll see, answer in a definitive way as though it knows the right answer, but what you get sometimes is very visibly a little bit nonsensical. And so as the models are getting trained on larger and larger and larger bodies of knowledge, they're getting more accurate, and we're having fewer and fewer sort of bizarre results from them or things like that. However, as we'll see, the concerns around trust remain, and they still remain pretty compelling. So we define what large language models are. What is trust? Sounds like a philosophical question, but there are contexts that are important for us to consider when asking this question. So when we think about trust, most often we think about something not doing us harm, right? That's the first thing that comes to your mind. Do you trust that person, right? And trust, that's usually the most common thing. Could be emotional harm, could be physical harm, or whatever. And yes, that's a relevant context of the notion of trust. And one we'll talk about in the context of these LLMs. But the other context of trust is sort of believing in the integrity of what somebody or something asserts. So if you think about, for example, kind of your working life, or doing business, or maybe working with a vendor, right? The other context of trust is, will they deliver on what they say they're going to deliver on? That's an example of trust. It's a little bit more nuanced than the common one around kind of harm and deliberate harm or things like that. That's the one that, as we sit here with AI, is kind of the more immediate topic to consider. Is can you believe in the integrity of what you're getting? And what's really important to understand about these models is that they sound really, really smart. They sound very definitive in the answers they give. And because they come off as so credible, we're very, very, very tempted to immediately trust the accuracy of the information that they give. And what we're going to see is not always the best idea. So the first concern about trusting one of these is just going to be misinformation, specifically a model definitively answering a question in a way that sounds super knowledgeable, but is just completely wrong. This one was fun for me. This was a Facebook post I made under a year ago now. The models have gotten so much better that if I ask the same question about myself today, I get a much better answer. But I asked this question about myself to Bard. I said, what can you tell me about the American grandson of Hilmar Rexton, who's named Richard Hoyer? I'm Richard Hoyer. My grandfather was Hilmar Rexton. He was a fairly well-known shipping magnate from Norway in the mid-20th century. He also was a bit dodgy, so he got in a lot of trouble with taxes, and that's why a lot has been written about him. So there is a lot of knowledge about Hilmar Rexton, and so I figured maybe the Bard model knew something about him and maybe even knew a little bit about me. And there's a bit of information online about me through my work in FinOps and publications that I've done. So I thought, hey, let's take a shot. And it's really hilarious to see the answer. And this is a classic example of where the LLM sounds really confident in what it's saying, but 98% of what it gave me here was nonsense. So Richard Hoyer is the American grandson of Hilmar Rexton. That statement is true. So you're going to think, okay, that's what I thought. A Norwegian shipping magnate who went bankrupt in the early 80s. That is also partly true. My grandfather had actually died by the time his shipping company went bankrupt, so he never went bankrupt when he was alive. So we're starting to go wrong, and now we really go off the rails. Hoyer was born in 1963. That dates me quite a bit. I'm younger than that. I'm not a young man, but I'm younger than that. Grew up in the United States. That's true. He attended Harvard University. True. And worked as a financial analyst in New York City. False. Did not work there. In 1994, he returned to Norway to help his father, Hilmar Rexton Jr., false on 2 accounts. In 1994, I was at Harvard. I never returned to Norway at that time. I had been in Norway years before that. My father is not called Hilmar Rexton Jr. He's called Sigurd Hoyer, who's the other side of the family. Managing the family's remaining assets, false. I never had any role in that business. Hoyer is now CEO of the Rexton Group, a diversified company that owns businesses in shipping, real estate, other industries. Completely false. There is no Rexton Group. Rexton Reddery did go bankrupt in the early 80s and was eventually dissolved. And so that business never was called Rexton Group and does not exist today. He's also chairman of the board of Rexton Foundation. False, no such thing. It doesn't exist. A charitable organization that supports education and cultural projects in Norway. There is a charitable organization my grandfather set up. It is not called Rexton Foundation. It's called something totally different in Norwegian. He's married and has children, lives in Oslo, Norway. False. I live in Maryland. So this is a great example of misinformation that can be out there. Again, this type of thing has gotten better today, but you will still need to be on guard for answers like this that sound incredibly credible and are totally wrong. And if you think about how we described what a large language model is, you can kind of see how this thing might happen, right? The model has patterns of facts and patterns of language it studied. Bard wasn't very mature or large a little under a year ago, 11 months ago. And so it tried to think of what the right answer to various facts about me were based on other patterns of information that it read. So maybe other people went and ran the family business. Maybe they were named after, maybe their father was named after their grandfather, etc. And it just said, well, that's usually a pattern that's true. Therefore, I'm going to assume it's true here. And of course, it got all that completely wrong. The other issue around integrity around these models has to do with bias. So the models are, again, trained on a corpus of information. And here's the key point here. They're trained on a corpus of information that somebody fed them, that somebody provided to them. So somewhere there's a group of humans who decides what a model is taught. And as you'll see if you study AI and large language models, it is literally, by definition, impossible to create a large language model that does not have bias. At a minimum from the start based on what it's trained on, but also as it is used, a lot of the live models like ChatGPT are real-time training based on what they find on the internet, and also they're learning from what people are asking them and how they respond to those queries, meaning that the users. And so you're going to start off inevitably with some kind of bias, and then that bias is expected to drift with the models based on what it experiences in the real world. So a couple of interesting, very recent events, a lot more recent than 11 months, like I just showed you on Bard. This has to do with Google's model Gemini, and most recently it was asked questions famously about keeping cheese from sliding off your pizza, and it talked about putting glue on them to glue the cheese down or eating rocks. And then vis-a-vis the bias here, early on, the rendering Gemini was released where it could make drawings for you, and as you can see, it just flat out avoided depicting white people. And so it was generating historical images of people that were people of color who in fact were not people of color in real history. And so this is a kind of really blatant example of where bias was built into Gemini, and in this case it was so egregious they shut down the image generating feature of the product, and they're sort of going to roll back out image generation when they fixed it. But we should all be very, very cognizant of the fact that in this case the bias was really, really overt and therefore easily detectable. In practice, as the models get more mature, they'll make fewer blatant mistakes, but all of us need to understand that there absolutely categorically is going to be bias in models. I've asked them questions before about historical facts around, for example, World War II, and seen really strange biases in the answer they gave, in the form of, not refusing to depict images of enemy soldiers, enemies to the Allies, on, in air quotes, our side. And that, again, is really whitewashing history, right? It's saying, well, I don't draw those images because they might offend people. But look, the war happened. There were two sides to the war. And I basically said, why are you whitewashing history? And it said, well, I'm not. I think other people might be offended by seeing the depictions of those soldiers. And today, if I ask the same question, it will draw soldiers that were enemies of the Allies. So that's an example of where they're trying to fine tune how much bias there is or to what end, and they're still sort of figuring that out. But the point is, there categorically is going to be bias in these, and we all need to be cognizant of that from the standpoint of trust. The other thing to be really thoughtful about vis-a-vis trust is knowledge about you and where it is, not can, going to leak, right? So some of the models say, look, we don't retain the information that you ask us unless you turn that on in the settings. So for example, in ChatGPT, you can turn memory on or off. Presumably that memory is kind of only for your own conversations. However, the models are learning patterns of language. It's not going to literally record your conversations, but they are retaining patterns of language numerically. And so, look, theoretically, it's just impossible to know for a fact that what you ask a model about is not going to be retained in some form. And so we are all very, very, very well guarded to think about what we ask these models and just basically operate on the assumption that the data is not going to be secure. In other words, operate on the assumption, being conservative, that anything you ask it, eventually some human could access. Hopefully that's not true. Let's just all operate as though it is. And so I would urge everybody to think about patterns like what topics you asking the model about. Is it the type of thing where if it became public what you asked it, you would be mortified or not? And it's sort of smart to sort of assume that you oughtn't to ask it topics that you would be very embarrassed about were they to become public. They're large language models, so they're looking at patterns, and so just be aware that if your moods are like angry or something bordering on violent, right? Just assume for the sake of argument that stuff at some point could be discoverable, and think through how you want to use them in a way that you're sort of, not necessarily revealing more about yourself than you would want known to other people. The same thing like patterns of thought, right? So if they're highly sensitive or personal things, one is almost well advised to just presume that there's not privacy with these, to be conservative on that side. Again, they say they're not going to leak your information, but who really knows? And of course, we know data breaches happen all the time. All right, so how are we going to mitigate these concerns around trust? Let's take each one in turn. Around bias, what I would urge people to do is just imagine that the LLM is another human, and just imagine that they're coming to any conversation with preconceived biases as you would were you having a conversation with somebody on social media. In other words, do not presume there is not bias, and look for patterns of predictable bias, some of which are more overt, again, with Gemini, but always assume those biases are there even when they're more subtle, and you can even ask the model probing questions. In order to set up this video, I was testing, looking for bias. They've gotten a lot better. ChatGPT is a lot more balanced. I asked it some very sensitive political questions, trying more or less to provoke it into being biased, and I didn't succeed. It was very, very, very neutral. It presented both sides of very sensitive topics. I did the same with Gemini. Found it a little bit more left-leaning than was ChatGPT, but also making much more of an effort to be middle of the road and showing both sides of an argument. So I think they're getting better here, but again, just be wary of the fact that you're dealing with something more like a human where bias is totally inevitable. Vis-a-vis misinformation, always, 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 if the accuracy of a fact is important, verify the source material. So I uploaded a large government report about social problems in Norway recently, and I asked it, to summarize 300 pages because I had about 5 minutes of my time I wanted to spend on that. And I got a summary, and where there were topics of interest, what you can do is say, tell me what paragraph number you found that statement in and give me the quote. And it gave me the quotes both in Norwegian and English. You can do the same thing with anything you query the model about. You made the following statement, tell me what your source was for that, especially if you're using this for your work life and where, like your job could depend on the accuracy. You really do not want to just assume that it's right, especially given some of the fun things I showed you about the inaccuracies earlier. We wouldn't want people to think that I lived in Oslo and stuff like that if your job depended on it, if you were asking questions about some other known person. Privacy. There's a really interesting axiom in security called trusting and disinterest. Okay, here's the axiom. Supposing two people are discussing a third party's marital affair, and you ask yourself, would they have an open discussion about that in a party, a social gathering of all their friends? Good Lord, no, right? Who might hear this? The scandal might get out. We can't do that, okay? The axiom of trusting in the disinterest of a party is, as the name would imply, where you can be in a situation where you would disclose information because you have no reason to think that somebody overhearing it would ever have any interest in it or use it against you. And so the same two people get into a taxi after that party, and they just start talking about the affair because the taxi driver has no idea who they are, who their friends are, and they just have absolutely no reason to believe that that this topic is ever going to get out. And so there's this idea that we behave this way, where we trust in the disinterest of parties. And I think that vis-a-vis privacy, we are ill-advised to do that with LLMs because we don't know who that third party may become if there is a breach, or if, frankly, we just find reason to distrust the provider of the service in the form of OpenAI or Google or whoever it is. So don't trust in the disinterest of the LLM when you're dealing with it. And then lastly, I'm coming back to the first idea of trust, which is this idea of doing direct harm. And look, right now, most applications of LLMs are chatbots, where we are seeing a lot of service offerings in industry that will have things called agents, and those agents will allow LLMs to actually take actions within a business. So they might be able to fetch information from some third-party piece of software and do something with it, or they might be able to take some kind of action via what we call an API, an application programming interface, such as turning off systems or things like that. So we're right now sort of crossing over into a period where, right now they don't do anything, they say stuff, okay? But we're crossing over into things where they are starting to do stuff. And there are widespread concerns about this in the very, very highest levels of AI science. And they don't have a plan. They just don't. The whole leadership of OpenAI split over this. The board became so worried about the safety that they actually fired the CEO, among other reasons. Then there was a revolt where half the staff said they were going to leave and join him at Microsoft, so they brought him back. And the highly safety conscious factions at OpenAI lost that gunfight, and they went back to a less cautious approach to OpenAI. And so the reality is, vis-a-vis this direct harm topic, stay tuned, because literally mankind is saying we hope this doesn't become dangerous, and that's our strategy, which is concerning. Let's just hope that let's just hope that strategy works. Okay, thank you all for joining us. Hope you found the video helpful. For more information, I've published a bunch about our field FinOps on our website, finoptic.io publications, and there are additional podcasts there. And I'm going to be releasing a course on AI for our discipline that will also be linked on that site. So if you want to know more about us, what we do, and this topic, go to our website.